I stood frozen before the heavy wooden door of my Santa Fe home, my trembling hands clutching my painful abdomen. My name is Alana. I am 21 years old, and at that moment, every single breath felt like a jagged blade piercing through my lungs. I had just left the hospital after a life-altering surgery that left me physically shattered, leaning heavily against the rough stucco wall for some desperate support while waiting for the door to open. When the front entrance finally swung wide, my older sister offered no comfort. She only glared at my pale, sweaty face with absolute unfiltered contempt. She completely ignored the surgical bandages peeking through my thin clothes, choosing to scream at me as if I were a lowly servant who had simply missed a scheduled shift. "What time is it that you're only getting home now? Stop pretending and go make dinner right now," she yelled, her voice echoing with a level of cruelty that finally broke my spirit into 1,000 pieces. However, her arrogant sneer quickly turned into a look of pure terror as a tall, imposing man stepped out of the shadows from right behind me, who had witnessed every second of her vile behavior with a cold, calculated intensity that suggested an impending storm. My sister's world was about to crumble into dust, but she was still too blinded by her own massive ego to realize the immense danger she was truly in at that moment. Do you believe a sister could be so heartless as to demand a freshly punishment that follows? 3 days before this nightmare began, my life in Santa Fe was still a quiet cycle of serving my older sister's every whim. My father, Preston, had spent the better part of the last decade working in overseas mineral mines to provide us with our sprawling estate in New Mexico. Since he was rarely home for more than a week at a time, he trusted my older sister Vera to manage the household and look after my needs while I finished my university degree. This trust was entirely misplaced because Vera viewed my presence not as a sibling to protect, but as a convenient, unpaid laborer who existed solely to maintain her expensive lifestyle. I spent my days balancing heavy textbooks in one hand and a vacuum cleaner in the other, desperately trying to keep up with my studies while scrubbing her spilled wine out of the carpets. Last Friday night was particularly exhausting because Vera invited nearly 20 people for an impromptu celebration that lasted until the early hours of Saturday morning. While she slept off her heavy hangover in the master suite, I was left to deal with the mountain of trash and sticky floors before my morning study session. I was carrying a heavy crate of glass bottles down the main staircase when my exhausted foot slipped on a patch of spilled liquid near the top step. The world tilted violently as I tumbled down the steep flight of stairs, eventually landing hard against the sharp edge of a marble pedestal in the foyer. A sharp localized heat bloomed in my abdomen, making it nearly impossible to draw a full breath as I lay curled on the cold floor for several minutes. I realized immediately that this wasn't a simple bruise because the internal pressure was becoming unbearable and my vision started to blur at the edges since Vera had turned her phone off to avoid being disturbed during her nap. I had to reach for my mobile and dial 911 with shaking fingers. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes to find me pale and barely responsive, quickly loading me into the ambulance while the house remained silent behind us. By the time I reached the emergency room, the doctors were already prepping me for urgent surgery to repair a ruptured spleen and significant internal bleeding. They worked for several hours to stabilize my condition while I drifted in and out of a drug-induced fog, surrounded by the sterile rhythmic sounds of hospital machinery. When I finally woke up in the recovery ward, my first instinct was to reach out to my father despite the massive distance between us. I managed to get him on the line, hearing the familiar hum of the heavy mining equipment in the background as he answered with a voice full of warmth. I didn't want to ruin his important contract or cause him unnecessary panic while he was stuck thousands of miles away, so I forced myself to maintain a calm tone. I told him that I had simply taken a small tumble and was staying at a friend's house for a few days to rest my bruised ribs. My father let out a heavy sigh of relief through the static, instructing me to rest well and promising to wire some extra money to cover my recovery expenses. It broke my heart to lie to him, but I truly believed that Vera would eventually step up once she realized I was actually in the hospital. My hope for any form of sisterly compassion was extinguished less than an hour later when my phone buzzed with a notification from Vera. She hadn't called to ask about my surgery, or even checked to see if I was still alive after the paramedics took me away from the house. The message was cold and incredibly direct, asking me where I had hidden the spare keys to the side gate because her friends wanted to use the pool. She didn't mention the blood on the foyer floor, or the fact that I had been missing for over 24 hours without a single word. When I replied that I was actually recovering from emergency surgery and needed help with the hospital bills, she simply stopped responding to my messages altogether. I realized then that to my sister, I was less than a human being. I was just a broken tool that was no longer useful to her. 8 o'clock the next morning, the shrill ring of my phone woke me up in the middle of a lingering post-operative pain that radiated through my entire torso. I fumbled for the device on the bedside table with a trembling hand, hoping to hear my father's voice, but instead, I was met with Vera's screaming before I could even say hello. She was not calling to check on my recovery or to ask if the surgery was successful, but rather to vent her frustration over a minor malfunction in the kitchen. Apparently, she had attempted to use the industrial microwave for the first time in months and immediately concluded that I had sabotaged the machine before leaving for the hospital. Her voice was so loud that I had to pull the phone away from my ear to avoid the sharp stabs of noise hitting my sensitive eardrum. "Did you intentionally break the microwave so I would have nothing to eat? You useless girl. Tell the doctor to let you come home and fix it right now," she shrieked without pausing to listen to any explanation I might have offered. I tried to explain that I was still hooked up to an IV drip and could barely sit up without assistance from the nursing staff, but she simply talked over me with more accusations. She firmly believed that I had rigged the expensive kitchen equipment to fail as a petty way of getting back at her for the cleanup from her latest party. This irrational logic made my stomach churn, because I had never once complained about the chores she forced me to do around the house. As I listened to her relentless verbal assault, a bitter memory of our life in Santa Fe flooded my mind, reminding me of the countless nights I spent scrubbing the floors. I had spent my entire youth following her around like a silent shadow, picking up empty wine bottles and discarded clothes while she enjoyed her freedom without a single consequence. Every time she hosted those loud gatherings in our living room, I was the one who had to wake up early the next morning to erase every trace of her irresponsibility. Even now, lying in a sterile hospital bed with a fresh surgical incision, she expected me to prioritize her breakfast over my own medical stability. Just as the call was reaching its most aggressive peak, my best friend Piper walked into the room carrying a small bag of warm takeout food and a bottle of water. She stopped dead in her tracks when she heard the muffled sounds of Vera's rage leaking through the speaker of my smartphone as I held it away from my face. Piper set the bag down on the rolling tray and stood silently by my side, her expression shifting from confusion to absolute disgust as she listened to the insults. I eventually hung up the phone when the pain in my stomach became too much to handle while trying to defend my own character against her madness. Piper immediately sat on the edge of my bed, her eyes burning with a protective fire that I had rarely seen during our years of friendship. "Alana, you cannot continue to endure this madness anymore. Your father needs to know the truth about what Vera has done to you over the last few days," Piper stated firmly, while handing me a cup of water. I shook my head slowly, feeling the familiar weight of family loyalty tugging at my heartstrings despite the obvious abuse I was suffering at home. I told her that my father was already under immense pressure with his work in the mineral mines and that I didn't want to cause a permanent rift between us. Piper argued that a true family member would never let a sibling bleed out in a hospital alone while they worried about a kitchen appliance. I spent the next hour picking at my food while Piper sat quietly in the chair beside me, waiting for me to make a decision that would change our family dynamic forever. I knew that calling my father and telling him the full extent of Vera's neglect would likely lead to a massive confrontation that could never be undone.